On Christmas Day, while most Americans were focused on family, travel, and the usual holiday quiet, the United States carried out airstrikes in northwest Nigeria, specifically in Sokoto State, targeting militants described as linked to the Islamic State. And the reason this matters isn't just what happened overseas, it's what it signals about how Washington is choosing to use American power right now, what we're being told the mission is, and what the long-term costs could be for the United States if this expands beyond a one-time operation. If you want clear, no-nonsense coverage of the stories that shape America's security and future, subscribe to the channel. We're going to stay on top of this. Here's what's been reported so far. U.S. officials and Nigerian officials say this strike was done in coordination with Nigeria and at Nigeria's request, aimed at Islamic State-linked militants operating in the Northwest. The reporting indicates the strike hit multiple militant camps, and U.S. officials described multiple targets being killed. President Trump publicly framed the operation as a response to killings he said were primarily targeting Christians, while Nigerian officials emphasized this was about counterterrorism more broadly and not about a religious war. That difference in framing is not cosmetic. It's the story. Because when the United States uses force abroad, the mission needs to be clear, limited, and tied to U.S. interests, not just in moral terms, but in strategic terms. Punishing terrorists may sound satisfying, but Americans have lived through 2 decades of hard lessons. If the objective is vague, the timeline gets longer, the footprint grows, and the American public is left holding the bill, financially, politically, and sometimes in lives. Nigeria's security landscape is complicated. The country has suffered for years under multiple threats, including extremist groups and armed factions, and violence that can be driven by ideology, local power struggles, and conflicts over land and resources. That matters, because when conflict has multiple causes, airstrikes alone rarely resolve it. They can disrupt networks, they can degrade camps, they can buy time, but they can also create blowback if civilians are harmed, if the targets aren't as clean as officials believe, or if a strike becomes a political lightning rod inside the country where it occurred. And we've seen this movie before. The United States goes in with limited action, then it becomes a repeated cycle. More intelligence flights, more strikes, more advisors, more coordination, more expectations, and suddenly you have a long-term commitment that wasn't fully debated, wasn't clearly defined for the American people, and wasn't tied to a measurable end state. Now, to be fair, there is a real argument for why the U.S. might support a partner government facing an extremist threat. It can protect regional stability. It can prevent terrorist safe havens. It can disrupt networks that might someday target Americans or our allies. But that's exactly why the mission needs to be explained in adult terms. If the goal is simply retaliation for atrocities, then what's the policy after the retaliation? If the goal is dismantling a network, what's the threshold for success? If the goal is deterrence, how do we know deterrence worked? These are not academic questions. They're the difference between a limited strike and another endless set of commitments that grows year after year. There's also the issue of messaging. When a U.S. president frames a foreign counterterrorism operation primarily through a religious persecution lens, it can have unintended consequences. It can harden sectarian narratives on the ground. It can increase the risk that militants recruit by claiming they're fighting a foreign-backed religious enemy. And it can complicate relations with local communities that are already caught between violent factions and an overstretched state. Nigerian officials, for their part, have pushed back on the idea that this is simply Christians versus Muslims, emphasizing that extremist violence has harmed many communities. That distinction is important, because America's goal should be to reduce terror threats and stabilize partners, not accidentally inflame the very dynamics that keep conflict burning. Another key detail. Reporting suggests the strike did not come out of nowhere. It appears to follow weeks of intelligence collection and coordination. That implies planning, and planning implies the potential for follow-on actions. And in fact, Nigerian officials have suggested further strikes could be possible. If that's true, then Americans deserve clarity now, at the front end, not months later when the footprint has already expanded. So what does this mean for the United States in practical terms? First, it's about priorities. America has serious challenges at home: border security, fentanyl, inflation pressures that never fully disappear for working families, infrastructure needs, and growing strategic competition with major powers. Every overseas operation, no matter how small, competes for attention, resources, intelligence capacity, and political bandwidth. The Pentagon, AFRICOM, the intelligence community, and diplomatic staff don't operate in a vacuum. If the Nigeria mission grows, it will draw from the same finite pool that has to cover everything else. Second, it's about precedent and mission creep. Once the United States demonstrates it will provide precision strikes as a partner's security tool, that partner may rely on it more. Other partners may ask for similar support, and Washington may feel pressure to act again to avoid looking inconsistent or weak. That's how limited becomes routine. Third, it's about risk, especially the risk of imperfect intelligence and civilian harm. Airstrikes are only as precise as the information behind them. And in regions with armed groups, shifting alliances, and limited ground truth, mistakes happen. When mistakes happen, the strategic impact can be worse than the tactical gain. You can remove a camp and still create a recruitment surge if local communities see the U.S. as careless or complicit in harm. That's not a moral lecture. It's a cold strategic reality that the United States has had to learn repeatedly. Fourth, it's about transparency and the constitutional culture of how America uses force. In a healthy system, major patterns of military engagement are explained, debated, and bounded. That doesn't mean telegraphing every operational detail. It means telling the public the purpose, the legal basis, and the conditions under which the U.S. will stop. That's what a serious country does, because the power being used belongs to the nation, not to a moment, a news cycle, or a political narrative. Now, here's where it gets even more consequential, and it connects to a separate but related development back home. In the same week as this Nigeria strike, the U.S. Supreme Court declined, at least for now, to allow the administration to deploy National Guard troops in the Chicago area while litigation continues. You don't have to be a constitutional scholar to see the broader pattern. The country is wrestling with the limits of executive power and the use of force, both abroad and domestically. Overseas, presidents often have wide latitude. At home, there are sharper constraints and higher scrutiny. When those two realities collide, you can get a government that is more willing to use power where it's easiest and less willing where it's legally contested. That is exactly why Americans should pay attention when overseas operations begin to stack up without a clear endpoint. So what's still unclear here, and what should you watch? Watch point 1. Will the U.S. describe this as a one-off strike or as part of a continuing campaign? The language matters. When officials start saying things like, "more to come," that's a signal of an ongoing posture, not a single action. Watch point 2. Will Congress ask hard questions? Not performative questions, real ones. What's the mission objective? What's the legal framework? What's the measure of success? What's the risk management plan for civilian harm? Watch point 3. How does Nigeria frame this going forward? If Nigerian officials emphasize sovereignty, legality, and partnership, that may indicate they want continued cooperation, but also want political cover at home. If domestic pressure builds inside Nigeria, the partnership could get complicated fast. Watch point 4. Do we see verified reporting on the aftermath? Displaced communities, civilian impacts, militant retaliation, or escalation by other armed groups? Those details determine whether this strike reduces a threat or becomes gasoline on an already unstable fire. Now let's talk through a few plausible scenarios, and I'm going to keep this grounded. No fake certainty. Scenario 1, more likely, the strike stays limited, but it becomes a template. The U.S. conducts this operation, monitors the aftermath, and keeps intelligence coordination active. If militants regroup or shift locations, Nigeria may request follow-on actions. That becomes a pattern of occasional strikes rather than a sustained campaign. The risk here is gradual normalization, little decisions that add up over time. Scenario 2, possible. The operation escalates into a more sustained counterterrorism campaign. Additional strikes occur, surveillance expands, and U.S. involvement becomes more visible. That can put American credibility on the line. If the violence doesn't meaningfully decline, Washington could face pressure to do even more, or face criticism for doing it at all. This is where mission creep becomes a real strategic hazard. Scenario 3, less likely but serious. Blowback, civilian harm, disputed targeting, or strong political backlash inside Nigeria could turn this into a controversy that damages U.S. Nigeria relations, fuels extremist propaganda, and complicates America's broader standing in the region. Even if the strike was tactically successful, the strategic outcome could become negative if the aftermath spirals. And here's the patriotic bottom line. America's power is real. Our capabilities are unmatched. But power used without discipline, without clarity, and without a defined end state can weaken the country over time, financially, politically, and strategically. If this Nigeria strike is part of a smarter approach to prevent terror safe havens and support a partner nation in a limited, well-defined way, then the American people deserve a clear explanation of the terms. If it's the start of something bigger, then the American people deserve an even clearer debate about whether that path serves U.S. interests. I want to hear from you in the comments. What city are you watching from? And what's your take on this situation? Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next update. And if this was useful, hit like. It helps more people find the full story. We're going to keep following this as it develops. Because the real question isn't whether the United States can strike terrorists in a remote region on a holiday. The real question is what comes next. Who decides what next looks like, and whether Americans will be told the truth about the scope and the stakes before the commitments quietly grow. In foreign policy, the first strike is rarely the final chapter. The chapter that matters is the one where the mission either stays disciplined or drifts into something the country never agreed to carry.